lecture series. My name is Peter McKeith. I'm the Dean of the Fay Jones School of Architecture and Design. Under other circumstances, certainly last year at this time, we would be meeting at 4 p.m. in the red-seated Schollmeyer Auditorium in Walker Hall at the school on our campus. We don't have that pleasure this evening, but we do have the pleasure still of hosting Sara Carr for this evening's lecture. In a moment, I'll ask for Sara to be introduced, but just some preliminary announcements in general about the lecture series and some acknowledgements of our partners in this enterprise. We're very privileged in any given year to have a lecture series of extraordinary quality, bringing to the school distinguished practitioners, scholars, researchers, critics, educators in architecture, landscape architecture, interior design, urban design, many subjects well beyond, in fact, the formal disciplines of architecture and design. This year is no different in many ways, and yet exceptional in other ways. And in a moment, I'll ask Assistant Professor of Architecture, Brian Holland, to give us a sense of the shape that this year's lecture series is taking. But we've been able to shape this lecture series not only through Professor Holland's skill in curating our lectures, but also through our partnerships, importantly, with the University of Arkansas Office for Diversity and Inclusion, important partners in many of our enterprises now in the school. And then more nationally, we are very pleased and privileged to partner with the Places Journal, an online journal of architecture, landscape architecture, and urbanism, with whom the school has been affiliated for many years, and with whom we're very pleased to work with on this lecture series in order to promote the school, but very much to promote this intellectual series to a much larger audience than ever before. It's equally important to recognize our local collaborators and our local sponsors, our good friends to the school, Ken and Liz Allen of Fayetteville, Arkansas, who have seen from the very start of this reformulation of our lecture series the need to underwrite it with significant funds that have allowed us to bring this lecture series into existence. And I'd like to say on behalf of the school, my thanks to Ken and Liz Allen, my thanks to Nancy Levinson, Deborah Lilly at the Places Journal out there in San Francisco, and certainly to all of our colleagues at the University of Arkansas Office for Diversity and Inclusion for their collaboration with us on this evening's lecture and the ones in the weeks to come. It is an exceptional moment for us, but it is an important one, and we are very grateful to all of you who are now joining us in the school, in the university community, nationally, and hopefully internationally for tonight's lecture and the ones in the weeks ahead. Now with that, I'd like to ask Brian Holland, Assistant Professor of Architecture, to say a few words as to the shape of the lecture series and what we can expect in the weeks to come. Saying so, I'd like to thank Brian very much for his skill and leadership in this effort. Brian, please.
Thank you very much, Dean McKeith. What role can designers and architects play in addressing the many challenges we're facing today? How can we, as design students, educators, and professionals, best utilize the training and tools of our disciplines to build a more equitable and just world? In a time of great collective urgency, what projects, histories, and ideas can help us better understand how design has shaped the spaces and structures we've inherited, for good and for ill, and how can we learn from past mistakes while strengthening our commitment to the design of a better future? Good afternoon, everyone. Despite what the Zoom caption says today, my name is not Ken McCown, but rather Brian Holland, and I'm an assistant professor of architecture here at the Fay Jones School. I also coordinate the public lecture series here at the school, which has gone virtual this semester for the very first time. It is my pleasure to welcome you to the first event in what promises to be a thought-provoking and inspiring fall lecture series. I first want to thank and acknowledge our institutional partners in this semester's lecture series. We're presenting these 6 lectures in collaboration with Places Journal and with the University of Arkansas Office for Diversity and Inclusion. Places Journal is an essential and trusted resource on the future of architecture, landscape, and urbanism. Places harnesses the power of public scholarship to promote equitable cities and resilient landscapes. Thank you to Nancy Levinson and Deborah Lilly at Places for their valued partnership in this series. And thank you also to Yvette Murphy-Irby, Vice Chancellor for Diversity and Inclusion with the U of A Office for Diversity and Inclusion for her support. Lastly, I want to thank my faculty colleagues for their valuable contributions to the shaping of this series, and especially to Dean McKeith for his vision and support of the lecture series. We begin the series with tonight's lecture by Sara Carr, for whom Professor McCown will provide a fuller introduction in just a moment. Next Monday, we will gather again in Zoom for a presentation by Mira Henry of the design practice Current Interests and faculty member at SCI-Arc. The following Monday, October 19th, we will host Marion Weiss and Michael Manfredi of Weiss Manfredi Architecture, Landscape, and Urbanism in New York City. We are glad to have been able to reschedule their lecture from the spring, which was postponed, of course, due to the onset of the COVID-19 pandemic. Also based in New York, where she is recently appointed Dean of Architecture at the City College of New York, is Leslie Loco. Dean Loco will deliver her lecture to us on Monday, October 26th. Then on Monday, November 2nd, we will host Michelle Joan Wilkinson for a lecture. Michelle Wilkinson is a curator of architecture and design at the Smithsonian Institution's National Museum of African American History and Culture in Washington, D.C. And finally, on November 9th, Irene Chang, an associate professor and architectural historian at the California College of the Arts and co-editor of the recently released book, Race and Modern Architecture, will deliver the final lecture of our series. I thank you for joining us today, and on behalf of the Fay Jones School, Places Journal, and the Office for Diversity and Inclusion, we look forward to seeing you again for each of these upcoming lectures. Dean McKeith, should I turn it over to Professor McCown?
Brian, I think if Byron McCune should just say a few words about our question function and then also our continuing education credits.
Certainly, absolutely. Thank you for the introduction, Peter. For those of you who don't know, my name is Byron McEwen. I'm the Fay Jones School of Architecture and Design's Special Events Manager and Public Programs Coordinator, attempting to run everything on the back end here. So a few things. We are using the webinar format of Zoom, which allows you to do this Q&A feature. You'll notice it at the bottom of your screen where you're viewing the presenter. There should be a little bubble chat icon that says Q&A. Please submit all of your questions there. Dr. Carr will not be able to read them as she's going through her lecture, so we're compiling all of them for the end. Professors McCown and Diaz-Montemayor will collect them and we'll ask those at the end. Of course, if you have any at that time, there should still be room to ask, so please, again, utilize the Q&A feature. For those who may have been looking for accommodations regarding the spoken part of the lecture, all of our lectures will be recorded, so if you're not able to see all of this, you will be able to view it later, as well as our recorded versions of the lecture will have a closed caption feature. So that is useful there, as well as if you are attending the lecture today for AIA or ASLA continuing education credits, please pay attention after the webinar is over because it will auto direct you to a survey that will ask for your first, last name, and membership ID number. These are required in order for us to get you those credits, but just fill that out, we'll collect the info, and we'll have you taken care of. Thanks for coming to the lecture.
Thanks so much, Byron, and thanks for your help on the back end. Without further ado, I'll ask Professor Ken McCown, head of the Department of Landscape Architecture, to, at long last, introduce this evening's lecturer, Sara Carr. Professor McCown.
Thank you. And once again, I'd like to extend one more warm welcome to the audience, and definitely a wonderful welcome to Sara. We're so happy to have you. And this is such a great lecture to lead off our series this year. So let me give you a quick biography of Professor Carr. Sara Carr is an assistant professor of architecture and the program director for the Master of Design and Sustainable Urban Environments program at Northeastern University. She is a licensed architect and holds an MArch from Tulane University and an MLA and PhD in environmental planning from the University of California at Berkeley. Her work and research on the connections between urban landscape, human health, and social equity has been funded by the Mellon Foundation, San Francisco Planning and Urban Research, and the National Science Foundation. In addition, she has been published in outlets from Preventative Medicine to LA Plus Journal, as well as interviewed by the New York Times, CNN, and Foreign Policy, among others, for her expertise on epidemics and urban design. Her forthcoming book, The Topography of Wellness, How Health and Disease Shape the American Urban Landscape, will be published by the University of Virginia Press in 2021. Sara, welcome.
Thank you. Thank you, Ken, for that kind introduction. Thank you to Dean McKeith for hosting me here today. And thank you especially to Brian for inviting me and for kicking off an incredible series. I'm really honored to be the first speaker tonight, and I look forward to watching the rest of the lectures myself throughout the next couple of months. And probably somewhere out there in the ether too, I have to extend a thank you to Places Journal, especially Nancy Levinson and Francis Richard, who I'm actually working on another piece for right now, which I'll talk a little bit about in the lecture today. So thank you to all of you, and thank you to all of you that are taking the time to attend this lecture tonight. So with that, I will get to it. Okay, can you see my screen, Brian? Okay.
Yes, we can see it.
Okay, full slide. Okay, great. Okay. So once again, thank you for having me here today. Obviously, it's been a strange several months for everybody. Personally, it's been very strange as a heretofore obscure academic who has suddenly had a lot of attention on their work. Even as someone who has been looking at how health and disease have formed the urban landscape for a decade now, I'm honestly still trying to wrap my head around what the COVID-19 pandemic means. And while I don't have any predictions about its future, what I do want to talk about tonight is how the history of American epidemics got us to the landscape we currently inhabit, and what we must keep in mind at this particular inflection point in time. So I wanted to start just with a little personal history and talk about how I got to this field. As Ken mentioned, I got my architecture degree at Tulane University in New Orleans, and I actually started my career working on healthcare facilities. At that time, I became really fascinated by the body of evidence-based design employed in thinking about architecture and patient outcomes. In particular, I was interested in the landmark study from 1984 by Roger Ulrich showing that post-op patients that were in rooms facing trees healed faster, sometimes up to a whole day, and required less pain medication than patients facing a brick wall. I was really interested in projects such as these cancer centers that let patients look out on gardens during their long chemotherapy sessions and recovery. And I was especially drawn to the books on therapeutic landscapes by Claire Cooper Marcus and Naomi Sachs. Environments that I had always known as defined as sterility, by their sterility, to see this trend towards introducing landscape was really invigorating, especially as someone that went to architecture school, not really knowing about landscape architecture as a field, but knew I was always interested in what was going on between buildings. And of course, the other part of this story is that I was working on these healthcare facilities at the time in New Orleans, and I was living there when Hurricane Katrina hit in 2005. Like most people there, I evacuated. I happened to have the privilege to come back when many didn't. But for the next year, my life was really consumed with the recovery, doing FEMA surveys, rehabilitating client buildings, and going to community planning meetings. And it really got me thinking that in the absence of hospitals, which is how it was for some time, how does the urban landscape heal and harm us? And so this is what led me to a career shift to go to UC Berkeley to get my MLA, and then eventually a PhD in environmental planning, exploring these issues. And when I think when I began this particular shift, I naively thought I would come up with some sort of landscape guidelines for health, maybe similar how you would read the AIA AAH guidelines when you're doing a healthcare facility. And even if I thought that was my goal, I think I had already seen how landscape could be wielded to displace people in the name of well-being and safety, in particular, the type of unspecified top-down green space that we often see in vision plans. For those that are not familiar, this is the infamous green dot map, which was released by the Bring New Orleans Back Commission in 2006 after Hurricane Katrina, which just sort of widely sent low-lying areas to be raised for parks, essentially. This was very discomforting for anybody that lived here, even with outside the green dots. And to be in New Orleans during the recovery and hear the conversation about rebuilding quote unquote healthier communities and what was implied in that drove me to look for more specific answers about what exactly that meant. And so while I did, and I still strongly believe in the power of urban landscapes in addressing health, I did come in somewhat skeptical of how these conversations were being framed. And then another dimension of my research was inspired by where my first academic appointment was. Up until a couple of years ago, I actually held a joint appointment in the School of Architecture and Office of Public Health Studies at University of Hawaii at Manoa. Living on an island, I became interested in how ecology and climate change are related to health outcomes. And as I mentioned, I'm actually currently working on a piece for Places Journal, which is looking at ahapua systems, which is an indigenous closed loop system of land management, and how their fracture relates to the urban landscape of Honolulu and how it relates to Native Hawaiian health outcomes. It was a really great opportunity to, I think, be enmeshed in a discipline that was completely outside architecture, meaning public health, and witness and be a part of how they do research and practice. What I'm showing here is just some work we did in a class that I taught with the Native Hawaiian Health Program at Queens Medical Center, which was designing spaces outside the healthcare facility itself. This is a class of half doctoral students in public health and half architecture students, whereas the former acted as practitioners and experts, and the latter went to work as interpreters. And this is a community hale, so a gathering place or community center outside Queens Medical Center, with a design based on the hapu'u fern, which is a medicinal fern in the Hawaiian culture. But in an effort to better understand how our present day landscape shapes our health, I wanted to better understand the history of shifting ideas about public health and the public realm. And what started as somewhat of a chapter-long detour in my dissertation has now become a book that will be out early next year from University of Virginia Press. I'm very happy to show the cover design for the first time tonight. I just received it. They gave me permission to share. And tonight I'd like to explore some of those ideas along with some nascent thoughts about how we go from here, nascent thoughts which need to be hastily added to the book manuscript as right before publication. I turned in the manuscript just before the pandemic hit, unfortunately. But what I was interested in is this particular dichotomy. We know that the places we live are inextricably tied to our health. Modern day diseases are often a complicated knot of genetic, lifestyle, and environmental factors. In 2016, Karen DeSalvo, Interim Secretary of the US Department of Health and Human Services, noted that public health had entered a new era where one's zip code is a better indicator of health than genetic code. So how did we move from the conception of an unhealthy environment being a densely populated urban center to the car-centric suburban and exurban environment decried by many planners and public health researchers today? Prior to the current pandemic, what we had seen was a shift over 150 years in what was considered a healthy or unhealthy environment. And the idea that urban areas affect our health are by no means new, but from the mid-century on, the perceived effect was wholly negative. Literature describing the so-called urban crisis decried the corrupting influence of the city, from its environmental hazards to its social ills, but also envisioned the city as a metaphor for the body itself. We know the popular conception of parks as the lungs of the city, an argument landscape architects and urban planners used to argue for increased urban forests and parks to clean polluted air. However, urban blight was also described as a cancer, to be contained, inoculated, and eliminated, a platform on which to advocate for urban renewal. And even after germ theory severed formal collaborations between urban planning and public health, which I'll talk about in more detail tonight, we've always sought to understand cities in terms of our own bodies and vice versa, as we see in these plates from O.M. Unger's city metaphors. And although Unger's was also talking about machines here as a third leg of this understanding, So intestines are to sewer systems or to exhaust pipes, bones are to streets or to chassis of a car, and nervous systems are to power grids or to electric systems. It is, though, the thought of the city as a locus of health rather than a locus of disease is new, as is the idea of the suburbs as an incubator of illness. The body of early 21st century literature that celebrated the city came as a result of chronic disease, particularly those diseases related to obesity, had surpassed infectious disease as the primary cause of mortality in the United States. And public health researchers and urban planners and designers have sought to reconnect those fields. When I began my dissertation work, I realized that there was actually an abundance of literature that provided guidelines for healthy places. But they, much like the green dot map, presented designing the built environment for health as a straightforward and unambiguous act, when I knew from my experience in New Orleans that rebuilding cities and neighborhoods where people live is a much more fraught than architects and urban planners often make it out to be. So how did we get here? So loosely theorized, I would say that in response to epidemics, we have often redesigned our environments to control miasma, germs, and behavior over time. So to first talk about miasma, in Hippocrates on airs, waters, and places connected the health of the environment to the health of those that inhabit it. His writings describe the difference between wholesome and unwholesome waters, the latter being marshy and stagnant, and those who drank from the waters as in possession of large and obstructed spleens, their bellies hard, emaciated and hot, and their shoulders, collarbones, and faces emaciated. Hippocrates' theories had wide acceptance well into the 20th century, most notably in the form of miasma theory, which associated tangibly foul air and water to airborne disease. The first movement connecting the built environment to population health correlates to the beginnings of American urban history during the Industrial Revolution. As factories and workforce populations grew in city centers, so did the amount of waste and sewage dumped in streets. Slaughterhouses were often still inside city limits, there was no municipal sanitation, and air pollution was rampant. Many housing units lacked indoor plumbing or sufficient light and fresh air. Massive outbreaks of cholera, typhoid, and yellow fever required coordinated action between planners, engineers, public health officials, and doctors in these fields. Of particular concern were crowded tenements. This cartoon, featured in Frank Leslie's illustrated newspaper in 1865, was entitled "The Tenement Houses of New York, How the Poor Live in Crowded Cities, How Pestilence is Generated, How the Parents are Demoralized and Their Children Depraved, the Great Source of Destitution and Crime." Social scientists who were just beginning to explore the connections between environment and behavior pointed to physical density as a risk factor for moral contagion as well as disease spread. As cholera became ever more correlated with the generalized urban condition, especially dense housing, this idea really held in the popular imagination. Here we see cholera as a skeleton telling the landlord of a tenement that he is about to occupy the premises. And tenements were routinely described as perpetual fever nests by New York sanitary inspectors in their surveys. And so the first and biggest changes to our cities in the name of health came from a massive sanitary infrastructure in the United States. It was during this time that many combined sewage, wastewater, and street runoff systems were installed in cities. Naturally open waterways, which also often served as worker encampments as well as waste conveyance, were contained in underground culverts and paved over. Marshlands were filled in, not only to rid of miasmic gases, but to accommodate industrial expansion. The outfall of these waste systems was still often in an open water body, but at least it was moved out of the city. And many subscribe to the idea that the solution to pollution is dilution. It's interesting to note that a lot of these systems are still in place today. And although a significant body of scientists and doctors actually did not believe in miasma theory or that disease was spread through the air, a multi-pronged strategy of personal and municipal sanitation, alleviating the density of the city, and remaking or removing industry and worker housing radically remade the previously haphazard landscape of American cities. We can see here in this 1895 edition of Harper's Weekly, comparing photos of the same street corners 2 years earlier, what an incredible transformation street cleaning had affected. Waste infrastructure reconfigured the streets of cities to make them longer, straighter, and wider. Cobblestones thought to hold miasmic filth between them were switched out for pavement that could be washed down at the end of the day. And at this time, many were looking to Europe to see how they had controlled their own cholera epidemics, specifically the massive underground waste infrastructure that they had installed. In his book, Flesh and Stone, Richard Sennett discusses how many 18th and 19th century European cities prioritized circulation and movement via their street networks in the wake of physician William Harvey's discoveries about how the heart powered blood circulation. Dirt and grime were thought to clog healthy airs throughout the city. Palaces and places of commerce acted as hearts that powered movement, and one-way streets were employed to maintain fast movement and mimic the directionality of veins and arteries. This inspiration is probably most clear in Daniel Burnham's plan of Chicago in 1909, which took direct inspiration from the streets of Paris. And with streets and sanitary infrastructure transformed, American cities turned to parks as a way to breathe fresh air into cities. Frederick Law Olmsted, the designer of Central Park, was also the executive secretary of the U.S. Sanitary Commission. His time there convinced him that density and slum conditions were the root causes of disease, and that disease was carried through water and the atmosphere. Central Park and many other of its parks leveraged fear about the detrimental health effects of diseases to advocate for the health benefits of green space, from providing a mental health respite from the business of the city to the supposed filtering effects of trees on bad airs. Frederick Law Olmsted was an early advocate of what we would now call ecosystem services, and he wrote on public parks and the enlargement of towns in 1870, "Air is disinfected by sunlight and foliage. Foliage also acts mechanically to purify the air by screening it. Opportunity and inducement to escape at frequent intervals from the confined and vegetated air of the commercial quarter, and to supply the lungs with air screened and purified by trees, and recently acted upon by sunlight, together with opportunity and inducement to escape from conditions requiring vigilance, wariness, and activity toward other men." The associations between density and disease would eventually manifest themselves in Ebenezer Howard's Garden City, a town model that sought to effectively combine the mobility of the city with the perceived health of rural life, and of course moved people out of the city entirely. By giving each imagined citizen a fixed plot of land, distinct pedestrian networks to a downtown, and a collective agricultural greenbelt and town fund, Howard was not only proposing simple exposures to natures, but prescribing exacting economic and social relationships. The density of the Garden City model is approximately 5,000 people per square mile, which is almost the same as many inner ring suburbs today. However, the cities were never built as a self-contained social and economic unit in the United States, mostly due to the elimination of the green belt due to space constraints for some of the towns that were built, and the failure for individual farming to catch on. That said, many in the US were still attracted to the suburbs' promise of fresh air and individual plots of green space, and the Garden City provided the template for many of our early American suburbs. Health, and specifically the search for fresh air, was in fact a large driver of the move to Western cities like Phoenix and Denver, which grew significantly by specifically recruiting asthmatics. Dr. Charles Dennison's Rocky Mountain Health Resorts, written in 1880, advertised Colorado as the Switzerland of the Americas, evoking images of clean mountain air and the generally accepted superior moral values of Europeans. This map by Dennison attempts to show the climatic patterns of Colorado, specifically its dry, cool air. In the book, he details the conditions of each settlement in the state. Of Colorado Springs, he said, "It is the home also of a cultivated class of people who have been attracted to the state by health conditions." It was estimated that up to a quarter of people who settled in Colorado, Arizona, and California in the late 1800s and very early 1900s did so for their own health or for a family member's health. Ironically, agriculture and increasing irrigation supported plant growth in the future, and many ended up developing allergies. Nevertheless, by 1890, Denver had grown by almost a third, with almost 30,000 people moving there in order to treat consumption. This rate of growth would persist for the next 3 decades. However, the commonly accepted ideas of how the environment affected health and the serious study of how environments affected health were really upended with the development of vaccines. The immediacy of infectious disease abated somewhat, but it didn't stop architects and landscape architects from exploring these ideas. Knowing that the pandemics of the early 1900s, namely the flu and tuberculosis, could be addressed by medicine, density was maybe no longer an immediate concern, but thinking about how architecture could optimize bodies and health was still a fascination to many. Concepts of health and built environment became mostly theoretical at this point, but earlier ideas about miasma, combined with developing building technology and fears about the dangers of the streets, which were increasingly congested by cars, influenced architecture at this time. Corbusier's Radiant City was conceived as a vertical garden city, taking the sanitary infrastructure up as well. Corbusier envisioned all interactions as internal to the building itself, and so the street as public realm was eliminated. Corbusier thought he was liberating his building's residents from this filth or grime. Corbusier's machines for living were intensely focused on what was the right measurements for an individual, and thought that a community was made simply by reproducing those units over and over again. In his writings for the Radiant City, he specifies that for optimum health, there should be 14 square meters per occupant in a cell, meaning the apartment, 12 meters of plate glass window to let in sun, 4 meters and 50 centimeters divided by 2 to calculate the height of space. Air should always be at 64.4 degrees Fahrenheit. 8 liters were to go through the rooms every minute for exact respiration. 50 meters would be a reasonable height for building. There could be 1,000 people per hectare. No one would walk more than 100 meters to transport, meaning an elevator or taxi. And each residential unit of 400 by 400 meters would get a swimming pool from 100 to 150 meters in length. More so, he said that only 50 meters above ground level was pure air, which leaves you to wonder what was going on in the units below. And while Corbusier only has one built work in the United States, we can see the influence of his writing and the European consortium Scion in many public housing units built in the mid-century. But without the context of the European social safety net, many of these ideas that they pushed, extreme density to keep green space around buildings, reimagining the corridor as a place of social interaction, and perhaps most of all, the aesthetic disruption and separation from existing context ended up being detrimental to resident health instead. The mixed metaphors of bodies and cities were also wielded to ruinous ends in the mid-century. Cancer was an epidemic that researchers soon realized could not be conquered by vaccines, and a federally funded early 1960s study attempted to inject hundreds of monkeys with human tumors in a desperate effort to pinpoint a cancer germ to no avail. In Susan Sontag's Illness as Metaphor, written in 1977, she confronts the late 20th century era's preoccupation with cancer by comparing it to the previous TB epidemic, saying, "Now it is cancer's turn to be the disease that doesn't knock before it enters. Cancer that fills the role of an illness experiences a ruthless secret invasion, a role it will keep until one day its etiology becomes as clear and its treatment as effective as those of TB have become." The unknowability of cancer is what made it so terrifying, but also made it an apt way to communicate the direness of the urban condition and spur action. The concurrent epidemic of urban disinvestment, disintegration, and abandonment, commonly referred to as blight, often lean on cancer as a metaphor, especially as it appeared to similarly eat cities from the inside out in the form of fire, vice, and crime. Geographer Michael Deere wrote that the process of abandonment as it operates in space suggests an initial broad scattering of abandoned structures characterized internally by the occurrence of many small groups of abandoned houses. It is essentially a contagious sequence, contagion that has major implications for our understanding of the dynamics of abandonment and for later policy considerations. The treatment of blight as a disease extended to its documentation. Much like cholera before it, most notably John Snow's maps of affected properties, blighted properties were documented by public health agencies by going from door to door, seeking its vectors of contagion. A 1951 architectural forum advertising slum surgery in St. Louis shows blighted and obsolete districts beginning to encroach on the rest of the city grid, the former district shaded as if to erase their existing characteristics. Similar to how these blight maps depicted spread, an educational film from 1953 entitled The Warning Shadow used X-ray animations to depict the terrifying growth of a small black dysplasia on a man's lung. The film ends with the patient agreeing to a pneumonectomy, or surgical removal of the lung. Eradication by surgery or radium was always the preferred treatment to the disease. And architects and planners seized on this treatment as a model for how blight should be treated in cities. Many municipal departments, aided by private companies like the RAND Corporation, first attempted immunization, such as increased municipal services, including fire and police stations, and attempts to enforce stricter building codes. But when this failed, they turned towards an urban chemotherapy, the total eradication of clusters of blight. In his book, The City, Its Growth, Its Decay, and Its Future, E.L.L. Saarinen used the diagram of the disintegration of cells to discuss the disintegration of the fabric of the city, and a healthy cell as a model of rebuilding. Saarinen wrote, The slums he clears by piecemeal bending, and the old infects the new in short order. The planner must know, as well as the doctor, that when the head aches, the stomach might be out of order, and the planner must be aware of the fact, as well as the doctor, that vitality cannot be transfused into a dead organ. The dead organ must be removed and the transfusion affected in a healthy part of the body. He must unearth the roots of evil. He must amputate the slums by a decisive surgery, and he must transfuse vitality only into those areas that are protected against contagion. And as they had been in the sanitary movement, children were often invoked as innocent victims in order to further the cause. James W. Fallon, commissioner of the Urban Renewal Administration, in a talk entitled Slums and Blight, A Disease of Urban Life, showed Gussie, a cartoon depiction of a waif-like young white girl, as proxy for the deadly effect of slums on human lives. She is introduced standing on a pile of rubble or adrift on a sea of blight. The book shows a series of maps overlaying juvenile delinquency, lack of sanitation, tuberculosis, and population density, with the densest occurrences always pointing to the center of cities. Later, Gussie is shown wielding the gargantuan broom of code enforcement, of health and sanitation. To address this issue, urban renewal documents from New York City to San Francisco depicted strikingly similar landscapes: sleek, sterile towers on a flat platform of green. San Francisco's Jackson Square plan is shown as isolated from any existing fabric save for City Hall, with no mention of the Fillmore neighborhood as a cultural center for the West Coast small Black population. Indeed, 80% of those removed by urban renewal were Black, and in Baltimore, that number was reported to be 100%. The logic of blight as disease meant eradication, erasure, and reoccupation with a healthy graft of anonymous towers and green. Which brings us to our pre-pandemic moment. And pre-pandemic, in the absence of infectious disease, much of our urban planning and architecture trends have been focused on shaping behavior. A large part of this is due to the obesity crisis. The Centers for Disease Control reported that in the United States, the percentage of overweight adults hovered at 31% between 1960 and 1994. And the percentage of adults categorized as obese increased from 13% to 23%, meaning almost 55% of adults in the mid-1990s were overweight or obese. In 2005, it was estimated to incur over $190 billion, or almost 21% of all US healthcare expenditures. Researchers started to draw connections between larger patterns of change in society, ranging from food availability to technological attachment. But a great deal of literature started to point to sedentary lifestyles encouraged by the unabated suburban growth oriented around the automobile as a driver of the epidemic. By the end of the 20th century, the locus of disease would shift from the city to the suburbs. These figures notwithstanding, the definition of obesity is still problematic in many respects, from the unreliability of the body mass index, or BMI, and its relationship to overall health, to cultural and racial ideas of ideal bodies and diets. Nevertheless, many designers and urban planners saw an opportunity to elevate their practice in the name of public health, but sometimes instead exacerbated health inequities. And on a related point, though, many also pointed out that car-centric design exacerbates climate change in urban heat islands, which also represents a larger existential threat to all of our health. However, the new urbanism movement was particularly interested in this rising epidemic, and it was based on a highly specific urban and architectural code to build neo-traditional neighborhoods. Although not directly referenced, a document published by the American Public Health Association 30 years prior called Planning the Neighborhood is an obvious predecessor to the new urbanist literature, particularly in the APHA's preoccupation with density formulas, land use, and the architectural form of dwelling, with less attention to the overall landscape other than ensuring walkability. Some of the generalized observations and principles of suburbanation, written by Dwayne Flater-Zyberg, were common sense and even admirable in theory, but when enacted on the ground, it became almost immediately problematic. In their steadfast belief that the old way of building was best, they emphasized the historical blind spots of building for social and change and health, and uncritically doubled down. DPZ's urban codes were a prescriptive landscape, not just to address obesity, but a claim to also improve social cohesion, civic participation, and above all, eliminate unhealthy cars from the public realm. The early new urbanists were particularly taken with regional interpretations of European architecture in the Deep South, and Dwayne and Flater-Zyberg have cited that their inspirations came from a road trip to towns such as Savannah, Charleston, and Natchez, Mississippi, although they don't reference the racial, social, or class systems inherent in these different forms of dwelling. Most of all, building to the prescriptive guidelines was difficult to enact within our existing tangle of urban sprawl. And instead, many of these developments were relegated to being built on greenfields and far from job centers. And so in many cases, only increased the effects of sprawl. However, the willingness of governments to invest in the supposedly curative effects of new urbanism became apparent when in the mid-1990s, it was adopted as the standard architectural and planning style of public housing under the Clinton administration's Hope 6 development plans. Hope 6 did attempt to take some lessons learned from a disastrous mid-century modernist public housing development, proposing a scattered site strategy that would strategically infill often slightly higher income neighborhoods with smaller scale single or multifamily housing. But just as in the mid-century, the tactic of adopting a specific aesthetic for public housing, even if neo-traditionalist instead of modernist, still served to visually stigmatize those within, while continuing to imply that those living in it would be uplifted or have their morals and their health corrected through architecture. While it was mostly a failure of administration rather than design, the well-documented effects of displacement wrought by the Hope 6 program as old high-density units were torn down to build new, but less numerous mid-scale ones were built, was one of the largest detriments to residents' health. Nonetheless, the built environment is still widely viewed as a treatment for this particular epidemic, extending from the figurative prescription of new urbanism to now literally being prescribed by the US Surgeon General, as seen in their 2015 Step It Up campaign. To provide an environment that supports this behavior is definitely positive. I want to make no mistake about that. But it will take so much more to untangle our car-centric environments. As cities and walkable environments have become more in demand, these ostensibly healthier and greener neighborhoods have also become less affordable. And we need to interrogate the idea that at the same time the design, planning, and even public health community denigrates the suburbs, it is also a time when many of these suburbs are becoming more racially and economically heterogeneous, a far cry from those described 30 years ago in suburban nation. Moreover, we need to rethink the idea in the United States that where we live is a free choice, or that it always reflects one's moral fortitude. But this is also sadly appropriate for a country that has always conflated wellness with personal responsibility. So as I mentioned, I turned in the manuscript to this book just before the pandemic reached the United States, but I am thinking about how many of these recurring patterns that we see. And in fact, like many of you, I feel like we've seen a century pass by just in the past 8 months. The built environment does provide opportunities for, and it provides risks for health. And our conception of healthy places has changed with medical knowledge and different pandemics. But one thing is consistent is that healthy places are often only for people that can afford them. And wellness, rather than an ethic, it can become an amenity. All these fears of past epidemics have been made urgent again with COVID-19. We know now that it is in the air, it is an airborne disease. At the same time, we still sanitize our surfaces to get rid of germs, and we've changed our behavior to socially distance and quarantine. At the same time, many of the ways past epidemics were addressed in the urban environment have proven to be consistent to today's pandemic. We know still that green space is essential, sanitation is key, and the design of where we live is crucial. So naturally, architects and landscape architects are wondering how this will transform design. For what it's worth, I don't think it will lead to this or to this. And hopefully this doesn't become our permanent condition either. And nor is it even this. We don't know yet what the post-pandemic city will look like. And of course, the built environment can't address the failures of our health system, inequities in treatment, and most of all, it is not a vaccine. But every crisis forces us to rethink the way we live, especially hand in hand with emerging technologies such as the ones I discussed here, whether it's wastewater infrastructure, railroads, or mass production. That, along with the narrative of disease, is what forms our landscape. And there is another consistency between everything I've talked about here. Every epidemic, and the most guided of its built environment cures, affects immigrants and communities of color most negatively. In this cartoon from Puck magazine, color is conflated with newcomers. The title of the piece called "The Kind of Assisted Immigrant We Cannot Afford to Admit." Instead of viewing the poor as a population vulnerable to disease, we blame them for spreading contagion and have systematically removed and excluded them or subjected them to architectural experiments that are built on narratives and metaphor rather than epidemiology. A 1922 housing covenant for Silver Spring, Maryland read, "For the purposes of sanitation and health, no owner will sell or lease the said land of anyone whose race is a death rate of a higher percentage than the white race." Germ theory and the language of quarantine was extensively used in Baltimore's residential segregation ordinance of 1910, which kept Blacks from moving onto blocks that had a white majority of residents, even when a series of coordinated actions by the city had excluded Blacks from healthcare access and neighborhood improvements to begin with. In San Francisco's Chinatown, disease was used as a justification for the Department of Public Health to repeatedly raid and control the neighborhood's boundaries, and medical inspections and largely fabricated assessments on nearby Angel Island were also used to keep Chinese out of the city altogether. Consider how health has been used to exclude groups from desirable landscapes or conscribe them to landscapes of risk. A recent study from a group of University of California researchers argued that we must reckon with how our social practice has long-lasting physiological effects. By overlaying mortgage companies' redlining maps with health data, they not only found that these neighborhoods were still largely occupied by Black immigrants, but that there remained a plethora of environmental hazards from air pollution to high lead content in soil, resulting in many other disparities in health, one of them a 3 times higher asthma rate in Blacks than in whites in California. And let us not forget that even the most celebrated healthy landscape, Central Park, was designed by a revered landscape architect, abolitionist, and former public health officer, was built on the ruins of Seneca Village, a thriving African-American village that was nonetheless written up as a squatter's camp, squalid and pestilent in the popular press. So I ask you today that instead of thinking about decontamination rooms or plexiglass desks, we need to be asking ourselves about the conditions that cause urban heat islands and air pollution disproportionately in Black neighborhoods, which is now proven to be an underlying cause for COVID mortality. Instead of worrying about the conception of a very specific type of walkable and bikeable density that has dominated urban design discourse for the past couple of decades, perhaps we should concern ourselves with the crowded housing of frontline workers, the forgotten densities so eloquently written about by Canadian urbanist Jay Pitter in Azure magazine, or if they have equitable access to green space and public transportation. We should ask ourselves, what is it about suburban neighborhoods that we're now seeing the spread of it there? You know, in the beginning of the pandemic, I was asked by numerous press outlets if the high rates of coronavirus in New York and Boston signaled the quote unquote end of cities. But now that it's abated in these places for now, and I live in Boston now, the pandemic has spiked in many other places, the suburbs of Phoenix, the rural areas of South Dakota, where I actually come from, and most crucially, the Black and brown neighborhoods of the very same cities we were worried about before, places that lie at the margins. So why aren't we asking ourselves, what is it about these environments that is accelerating the rate of infection? The environment does not cause or cure disease, but it is a key factor in either providing opportunities for health or creating a landscape of risk for debilitating illness. As we endure this crisis and understand that there are others ahead of us, let us take what we have learned from history and shape a healthier and more resilient future for all. Thank you.
Thank you, Sarah.
Thank you. I'm just going to turn a lamp on. Sorry.
A virtual round of applause on behalf of 300 people or 300.
Yeah. Thank you to all of you out there.
Gabrielle, do we have any questions in the chat bar?
One question so far. An invitation to all 347 attendees to send questions. I guess the way this works is that I read the question, right? Sara, there it goes. Could you speak on ways that history of city planning has affected your ideologies? Specifically, how do you feel about the idea of a city being a collective whole, one design issue as approached by Le Corbusier, in comparison to a city being an organic, multifaceted group, like the ideas of Ebenezer Howard or Jane Jacobs? This question is by Nate Cole.
Yeah, I think, I mean, naturally, I'm sort of drawn to the city as an organic object, but I think that doesn't mean we can't study it in detail. I think, you know, and what I try and advocate for in my studios is to basically every neighborhood has worth, right? And everything has a sense of place. And that means the suburbs, like I said, I come from a rural community in South Dakota, and that means the cities. There's something of value to it there, but so much of our environment is built up. I don't know if we can understand it until we study them in detail. So although I am as enamored of the metaphors as any, you know, academic of the built environment, I think most of all what I learned over the course of researching the book is I and maybe others should be cautious of conceptualizing the city as a metaphor too much, and instead there's so much to be gained from just the pragmatic study of place by just talking to people in neighborhoods and addressing those issues first, because we are in a state of crisis. And again, these metaphors are extremely helpful, right? And they've definitely formulated my way of thinking. But at this moment, maybe we just need to listen, right, to the issues and think about hyperlocality while we think about these larger issues as well.
Thank you, Sara. There's another question by Valeria Guzman. Thank you very much for your lecture. How do you think digitalization, internet, cloud infrastructure, and social media, for example, enter as a new component into the wellness and health of the American urban landscape?
I think it's potentially really interesting. And actually in the book, I didn't talk about it here, but I talked a little bit about the first WELL certified community, which is in Tampa, Florida, and is seeking to, you know, put sensors around the city to kind of gauge health and gauge air pollution and gauge water rates. I think it's potentially exciting. I think, again, we have to be cautious about how we are getting that data. I did talk a little bit about, you know, these, I think a lot of Silicon Valley firms are looking at the potential of what we would call the quantified self, right? Of thinking about how we design cities and how we make healthier places. But as always, we have to ask, who's not present in that data, right? Who doesn't have a Fitbit, or whose smartphone isn't relaying that information that forms the city? That said, you know, this is what I tell my students all the time too. Data is extremely valuable as long as you are asking the right questions, right? And that's where it starts. And we sort of have to take a more holistic view and either find the data that helps us answer the question or get the data ourselves. You know, that said, like the technology of the data out there can help us better figure out networks, right? Pedestrian networks, as well as transportation networks. There's some really fascinating studies about that. But on the flip side of that, you know, thinking about how much data we put out there, we can see issues like the sidewalk labs in Toronto, right? Which is also meant to be a smart city and was also sold as a very healthy city. And I looked at the imagery of that a little bit too. And it's funny, like how similar their images of the healthy city are to a lot of the images that I showed here today that, that convey health. And so while some of these ideas are consistent through time, sometimes data is limited in how much it can actually tell us. And of course, there's privacy issues as well. And so when it comes to data and bodies moving in space and shaping cities, I'm maybe a little bit more reticent to be fully on board with some of those initiatives.
Thank you, Sara. There's another question here by Macy Callahan. Where do you think city and urban planning will be headed following the end of this current pandemic? Do you think there will be huge changes or not so much? I think you spoke about this, but you want to elaborate?
Yeah, I I don't think there will be huge changes, but I think there will be a large shift in perceptions, which will make everybody's job a little bit harder in the short run, particularly thinking about density in cities, right? But, you know, I told somebody that Americans have always feared density anyway, even though we didn't have to anymore, and maybe we do again. What we've seen in the coronavirus epidemic, I think is going to make a few things really difficult. One is restoring faith in our public transportation networks, right? I have not seen enough conversation about how we, even if they are generally safe, and we've seen in much more populated cities, such as in Japan and in South Korea, that public transportation is likely not a vector of disease, but the perception of it now, with the CDC actually recommending that people drive to work, is potentially ruinous, I think, for our landscapes. And that's something we're going to have to confront. And maybe it's not so much about the physical planning for it, but it's about advocating for its funding and changing the perception of these places. At the same time, you know, I don't put a lot of, as I mentioned, I don't put a ton of stock into this being the end of cities. I mean, cities have persisted over time. I don't think we would see the amount of disinvestment that we saw, you know, in the mid-century and thinking about the urban crisis. But I think we still have to see where the chips fall in shifts to working from home, right? And, you know, there might be a rising desirability of suburban neighborhoods. And so I'm not sure how city planning and urban planning practices will change. I think a lot of these practices were interested. I think a lot of people recognize these overlays with public health first, but I think the work we're gonna have to do on the front end is sort of confronting people's perceptions about urban planning and disease after having a couple decades of cities really being celebrated for being healthy places.
We have, it's adding more and more questions coming in. So far, 4 more. There goes in the order they were received. There's an anonymous attendee with this question. With your research and scholarship addressing public health, architecture, and landscape, how have you reformulated introductory history and theory courses to engage other disciplines and lines of inquiry, and perhaps critically of the canon?
You know, it's interesting. I don't teach history. I teach studio, and I teach a visualization course. So right now, actually, this semester, I'm teaching mostly software, even while I'm thinking about all these issues. But I think there's so much value. I learned so much when I had that joint appointment in architecture and public health at University of Hawaii, because they actually had me teach a series of social and behavioral health, even though I didn't have a ton of familiarity with it, just a little bit, you know, that I had studied for my dissertation. And I think that, I don't know about the canon, I think, you know, introducing disease narratives from historians and from public health history can be really valuable to how we better understand the post-COVID moment. But I think what a lot of architectural schools could benefit from is thinking about social and behavioral theory and how do you actually shift behavior? How do you work in communities? And I think above all, and this is something I'm trying to change in my own studio, but thinking critically about research methods in studios and how you, you know, how you interview and how you do surveys and how you study place. And so, I'm not, it might be obvious, I'm not trained as a historian. I was just very interested in the history because I wanted to know like where my practice is going in the future. And so while I don't know how we'll change the canon, I do hope in all my classes to kind of recontextualize how we've viewed the power of architecture and urban landscape over time.
Thank you, Sara. We are going to try to do 2 more, and they are piling up again, but there's a lot of interest. I think it was a fantastic lecture. Thank you, Sara.
Okay.
There's a question here from one of my students who you are going to visit on Friday.
Okay, great.
Hunter Atkinson. If metaphors too easily lead to oversimplifications of public health issues on individuals, how do we best respond to the hyper locality of place you mentioned, and how do you recommend communicating that to the public and to policymakers?
Oh, well, that's a great question, and hopefully we can talk about it more on Friday too, as I'm excited to see the projects in your studio. As I said, I think metaphors are very seductive and they get you to a certain point, right? But then you have to do the work of showing what a changed environment might look like. And I think, you know, what I learned so far over my career is that nobody wants their neighborhood radically changed, right? Even if, you know, somebody thinks it's not as valued. But I think what architects and landscape architects have, and the power that we have as educators and as students, is to show people those possibilities, right? And to show them the transformative power of design, even if it's small. And so I think while the metaphors maybe help us to conceptualize and maybe help us sell a concept, it does take that sort of detailed, hyper-local work and thinking about the qualities of place. So you're making small changes to make somebody's neighborhood better in the end.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Another question from another landscape architecture student, Matt King. What are your thoughts on tactical urbanism as a solution to issues of equitable design? Do you think it could serve as a way to solve community-specific issues on a city-wide scale, or more as a signal to shift resources towards real solutions or something different? Thank you for the amazing lecture.
Oh, thank you. And thank you for that question. I had a really interesting meeting with the US Civic Commons over the summer, which is a really great organization. If there are students out there that don't know about it, I would highly suggest looking at some of their material. And we actually did engage in a conversation about the utility of tactical urbanism. And you know, for me, I think tactical urbanism can be really interesting. And actually, I just assigned my students, you know, thinking about platforms of public engagement. So they're supposed to design a platform of public engagement. And so I told them it can be a website, it can be a board game, and it can be a space. And the value of tactical urbanism, I think, is to see how people act in space, right? When you make the intervention. And that's actually a part of public health practice. Maybe you are piloting an intervention and you see how people act in it. And you get the data, and then hopefully you make a better place after that. After talking to US Civic Commons, what an issue I had been cognizant of before, but they really helped clarify for me, is the problem with some tactical urbanist interventions is that they just stay at the tactical phase, right? Or there's no follow-up. And actually, I would have to say, you know, that is one concern I have with a lot of the changes we've seen in coronavirus. With, again, even, you know, increasing bike lanes is good. Increasing space where pedestrians can walk freely is a good thing. But are those interventions just going to stay there? Are those streets going to stay closed off with no further improvements? And does that block, say, public transportation from getting frontline workers where they need to be? The same, I think, like probably most other people on this call, I'm really, you know, excited about the move to outdoor dining and taking over parking spaces for outdoor tables, which is even happening in my, you know, small suburb of Boston. But that said, if you take over the sidewalk, you know, are you blocking people who are in wheelchairs from using the sidewalk? And if these things stay that way forever and there's no further improvement, or there's no critical thought about how it works in the context of the city, then that's a real problem. And so I think tactical urbanism has its benefits, but if you're working in a community, that tactical urbanist intervention has to come with the promise that something better and more permanent is coming afterwards, right? And then hopefully it does not do more harm than good.
I have to say, I totally agree.
Thank
you. Thank you. We had 5-6 more questions, but I think we may be already running over time. So unfortunately, we have to stop here.
Okay.
I'll shift to Ken or Brian. Thank you.
Okay.
Sara, I do want to ask one quick question, since we have so many students interested in this topic. Could you talk a little bit about the Masters of Design at Northeastern University and let the students know what might be of interest to them there?
Sure. So I was really excited with the opportunity to lead the program because I would like to think of it as not like a landscape light degree, although I will say if you have an architecture degree, you can do the Master of Design Sustainable Urban Environments in 1 year. What I was really interested in is, maybe getting to explore some of the issues that I didn't get to explore within an accredited MLA program, which was issues of policy, issues of social justice, and thinking about, how that you don't necessarily need to be a designer to know how to design sustainable urban environments, but you do need to know how to convene multiple people at the table, which I think actually has guided most of my career over time. And so what we do, what the program is that, if you don't have a background in architecture or landscape architecture, we do teach you some of those visualization steps, but we really try to expose our students to initiatives going on in Boston, who, for all its faults, is thinking really progressively about the intersection of racial and climate justice in the city. Put you in touch with practitioners. And, in the short time that I've been at Northeastern, we've had some really amazing, multifaceted students come through. In fact, one of my students that graduated last year became the first person of color to lead, to become the director of maintenance at the Boston Parks Department. And he did his degree while he was still working for the city in the maintenance department. And I think that's amazing, right? And it opens up to the possibilities of design while maybe not having, we have to confront, some of the hurdles that we have in design education, from the time you have to take off to the cost. And so, so if it interests you, please feel free to email me, sa.carr@northeastern.edu, or I'm happy to talk to you more about it.
Thank you, Sarah. I'm going to make a handoff to Peter, but before I do, real quick, for the audience, since we don't have an opportunity to give Sarah applause, if you wouldn't mind giving thanks in the chat bar, and also maybe mention something that you learned that you're going to move forward with from this lecture, that would be great.
Oh,
Peter?
Oh, can I ask, could you email me the chat transcript if there's anything that people want to learn later? I'd love to see it.
Hopefully Byron will
Okay.
be able to do that.
Thanks.
Sarah, before we lose you entirely, not only I want to actually bring one more question to bear into this, which is one that was put in by Charles Sharpless on our faculty in interior design. Mm-hmm. And the question had to do with really, again, education. And given that you're working at the intersection of policy and design, can we in fact see ourselves in design as policy makers? And if so, how do we best prepare for that type of future of working more in policy, some of us, than in design?
Yeah, so in something I found out in the course of doing the book, and actually inadvertently in the course of researching the book, I ended up working with a nonprofit that I still work with today called Design for Active Sacramento. And it started out as a nonprofit where we were actually reviewing the new vision plans for Sacramento County, and just figuring out how the planning initiatives were going to affect design, or how it was going to trickle down to urban design, and also marking possible policies that would, be beneficial or detrimental to health. And so I think I don't know if I don't have enough fluency to be policy makers yet, but I would encourage everybody out there to read policy documents, to work with policy makers to understand how long it can take to pass minuscule pieces of legislation, and know that that's just sort of the speed that works at, and how to gain consensus. And so I don't know if we can be policy makers right now. I also want to back off from the idea that architects and landscape architects and designers should be generalists, but I do think it's time for us to listen and understand how policies that are bigger than us do affect our work, and think more critically about that.
Well, that comes so close to the heart of what our intentions are with this series this fall.
Yeah.
And so not only have you given us a great point of origin for all the future conversations, but you've really given us specifics that clearly have stimulated our audience. So
Thank you.
on behalf of the school, thank you so much. On behalf of Ken McCown, Gabriel Diaz-Montemayor, Brian Holland, thank you all for your work on this. Byron McCune, again, I remind everyone in search of continuing education credits to hang in there for the survey, to place your name and registration number in. But Sara, thank you very much. We wish you well in Boston and going forward, and hope to welcome you to school.
I hope so too.
So,
okay.
Thank you so much, Sara. Terrific.
Thank you so much. Yeah, thank you so much. It's a real honor to be part of this amazing lecture series. So thank you all.
thank you. And
Thank you.
good night to our audience. Good night to all listening in. We'll see you here next week, same time, same place, for Mira Henry's lecture. And thank you. We'll see you again then. Thanks so much.
Okay.